Namaste, Assalamu alaikum, Shalom, Mir, Ni hao, Buenos dias, Hezeche, Aquaba, welcome, what up, though? This is Storytelling Therapy, session numero cinco. And in this session, we have tres stories. The first story is one of Jesus healing from the Gospels. Another story is the Buddha and the widow. And the third story is the cloud dream of the nine. The first of these stories is a narrative from the Gospels of Christian tradition. It is from the Gospel of Mark, and it shares a simple story of Jesus healing a man who is helped by friends. So this is specifically Mark chapter 2, verse 1 a 17. Mark 2, verse 1 through 17. A few days later, when Jesus again entered Capernaum, the people heard that he had come home. They gathered in such large numbers that there was no room left, not even outside the door, and he preached the word to them. Some men came bringing to him a paralyzed man, carried by four of them. Since they could not get to Jesus, because of the crowd, they made an opening in the roof above Jesus by digging through it, and then lowered the mat the man was lying on. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralyzed man, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Now some teachers of the law were sitting there, thinking to themselves, "Why does this fellow talk like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" Immediately Jesus knew in his spirit that this was what they were thinking in their hearts, and he said to them, "Why are you thinking these things? Which is easier, to say to this paralyzed man, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Get up, take your mat, and walk'? But I want you to know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." So he said to the man, "I tell you, get up, take your mat, and go home." He got up, took his mat, and walked out in full view of them all. This amazed everyone, and they praised God, saying, "We have never seen anything like this." Once again, Jesus went outside beside the lake. A large crowd came to him, and he began to teach them. As he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," Jesus told him, and Levi got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. When the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with the sinners and tax collectors, they asked his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said to them, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but the sinners." That is the Gospel of Mark, a story of Jesus healing the man lowered through the roof. The next story is of the Buddha and the widow. This comes from Buddhist tradition. And another title for this story is the story of Kisa Gotami. Here it is. This story is also provided from buddhanet.net. The story of Kisa Gotami. Kisa Gotami was a young woman from a wealthy family who was happily married to an important merchant. When her only son was 1 year old, he fell ill and died suddenly. Kisa Gotami was struck with grief. She could not bear the death of her only child. Weeping and groaning, she took her dead baby in her arms and went from house to house, begging all the people in the town for news of a way to bring her son back to life. Of course, nobody could help her, but Kisa Gotami would not give up. Finally, she came across a Buddhist who advised her to go and see the Buddha himself. When she carried the dead child to the Buddha and told him her sad story, he listened with patience and compassion, and then said to her, "Kisa Gotami, there is only one way to solve your problem. Go and find me 4 or 5 mustard seeds from any family in which there has never been a death." Kisa Gotami was filled with hope and set off straight away to find such a household. But very soon she discovered that every family she visited had experienced the death of one person or another. At last she understood what the Buddha had wanted her to find out for herself, that suffering is a part of life and death comes to all. Once Kisa Gotami accepted the fact that death is inevitable, she could stop her grieving. She took the child's body away and later returned to the Buddha to become one of his followers. That is the story of Kisa Gotami, the Buddha and the widow. The third story is the cloud dream of the nine. This comes from Korean tradition. The proximate provider of the story, the translation, is provided from the Westminster Press. This is actually the beginning of the story. It's a long, extended story. So this is the beginning of the story. There are 5 noted mountains in East Asia. The peak near the Yellow Sea is called Tai-san, the Great Mountain. The peak to the west, Hua-san, Flowery Mountain. The peak to the south, Hyeong-san, Mountain of the Scales. The peak to the north, Hang-san, Eternal Mountain. Whilst the peak in the center is called Sung-san, Exalted Mountain. The Mountain of the Scales, the loftiest of the 5 peaks, lies to the south of the Tongjong River, and on the other 3 sides is circled by the Sangong, so that it stands high, uplifted as if receiving adoration from the surrounding summits. There are in all 72 peaks that shoot up and point their spear tops to the sky. Some are sheer cut and precipitous, and block the clouds in their course, startling the world with the wonder of their formation. Stores of benevolent luck and fortune abide under their shadows. The highest peaks amongst the 72 are called Spirit of the South, Red Canopy, Pillars of Heaven, Rock Treasure House, and Lotus Peak, 5 in all. They are sky-tipped and majestic in appearance, with clouds on their faces and mists around their feet, and are charged with sacred influences. When the day is other than clear, they are shrouded completely from human view. In ancient days, when Hua-U restrained the deluge that came upon the earth, he placed a memorial stone on one of these mountain tops, on which was recorded his many wonderful deeds. The stone was sacredly inscribed in cloud characters, and whilst many ages have passed, these characters are clear-cut as ever. In the days of Qin Shi Huang, a woman of the genii named Queen Wei, who became a Taoist by sacred command, came with a company of angelic boys and fairy girls and settled in these mountains, so that she was called Queen Wei of the southern peak. It is impossible to relate all the strange and wonderful things that have been associated with these mountain fastnesses. In the days of the Tang dynasty, a noted priest came hither from India, and being captivated by the beauty of the hills, built a monastery on Lotus Peak. There he preached the Dharma of the Buddha, taught his disciples, and put an end to fearsome demons and foul spirits, so that the name of Gautama grew great in influence, and people bowed before it and believed, saying that God had again visited the earth. The rich and honorable shared of their abundance, the poor gave their labor, and so they built a wide and spacious temple. It was deeply secluded and quiet, with 1,001 beautiful views encircling it, and a majesty of impressiveness of mountain scenery for background that was unsurpassed. This preacher of the Buddha had brought with him a volume of the Diamond Sutra, which he expounded so clearly that they called him Master of the 6 Temptations, and the great teacher of the Yu Quan. Amongst the 500 or 600 disciples that followed him, there were some 30 well-versed in the teaching, and distantly advanced. One, the youngest of them, was called Song Jin, without guile. His face was fair and beautiful to see, and the light of his expression was like running water. He was barely 20, and yet he had mastered the 3 sacred books. In wisdom and quickness of perception he surpassed all the others, so that the master greatly loved him, and intended later to make him his successor. As the teacher expounded the Dharma to his disciples, the Dragon King himself, from the Tongjong Sea, used to come in the person of an old man dressed in white clothes, to listen and learn. On a certain day the teacher assembled his pupils and said to them, "I am now an old man and frail in body, and it is 13 years and further since I have been outside the mountain gates. Who amongst you will go for me to the palace of the waters and pay my respects to the Dragon King?" At once Song Jin volunteered. The teacher, greatly pleased at this, had him fitted out in a new cassock, gave him his ring staff of the heavens, and he set off briskly towards the world of Tongjong. Just at this moment, the priest who guarded the main entrance to the monastery came to say that the noble lady of the southern peak had sent 8 fairy messengers to call, and that they were now waiting before the gate. The master gave command that they be admitted, and they tripped across the threshold in modest order, circling about 3 times and then bowing and scattering the blossoms of the genie. They knelt reverently and gave their message from the lady, saying, "The noble teacher lives on the west side of the mountain, and I on the east. Whilst the distance is not great, and we are comparatively near as neighbors, still I am of humble birth, and am so busily occupied that I have never come even once to the sacred temple to hear the Dharma. I have no wisdom of my own to keep me in touch with the benevolent, but now I am sending my serving maidens to pay my respects, and at the same time to offer to your excellency flowers of paradise and fairy fruits, along with some other gifts of silk, which I sincerely trust you will accept as a token of my earnest heart." Each then made her presentation of flowers and treasures to the master. These he received and passed on to his disciples, who had them placed as offerings before the Buddha, which, with much bowing and folding of the hands according to the required ceremony, he replied, "What merit has an old man like me, I pray, to have such gifts as these presented to him?" He gave liberally to the 8 maidens in return, and they set off lightly on their way. They passed out through the mountain gate hand in hand, talking as they went. They said, "These sacred mountains of the south, being of one range and having the same streams encircling them, once upon a time were all within our own boundaries. But since the setting up of the temple of the great teacher, certain limitations have shut us off from freedom, so that we have not seen the beautiful places that were once our own. Now, by the benevolent fortune of Our Lady's commands, we are here in this valley at this lovely season of the year. It is early in the day. Let us take the occasion to go up to the heights and have a breath of the sweet air of Lotus Peak, dip our kerchiefs in the limpid water, sing a verse or two, and awaken our souls to the joy of life. On returning home, we shall be the honor and envy of all our sisters. Let us do this." They set off on their way, looking down with wonder at the rushing water, walking skillfully along the giddy ridges and following the streams. At last, on this happy day of the 3rd moon, they found themselves on the stone bridge that spanned the torrent. All the flowers were in bloom. The streams beneath them sparkled with silvery brightness. There hung a tent work of flowers and leaves like a silken canopy. The birds vied with each other in the beautiful notes of their singing. The soft breezes awakened glad and happy memories, whilst the beauty of the scene held them spellbound. Thus were the 8 fairy messengers charmed as they sat in delight on the bridge, looking down at the wonderful mirror of the streams that met and sparkled in a crystal pool below. Their delicate eyebrows and glowing bright faces shone forth, reflecting in the water as if seen in a famous picture from a master's hand. They were so entranced that they had no thought of going till the soleil began to descend towards the western hills and the day to darken. At this moment, Songjin crossed the Tongjong River and entered the water palace of the Dragon King. His Majesty, greatly delighted at his coming, stepped outside the gates to meet him, took him by the hand, led him in, and bid him share his throne. Songjin made his obeisance and gave his message from the master. The king in response bowed low and ordered a feast of welcome to be prepared, at which were fruits and dainties of the fairies in abundance, and of such flavor as the dwellers in the hills alone know. The Dragon King himself passed the glass and urged him to drink. Songjin several times refused, saying, "Wine is a drink that upsets and maddens the soul, and is therefore strictly forbidden by the Buddha, so your humble servant must not partake." But the Dragon King replied, "I am aware that amongst the 5 things forbidden by the Gotama, wine is one. But the wine that I offer is different altogether from the maddening kind that men drink. It represses the passions and quiets the soul. You will not mistrust my sincerity in offering it, I am sure." Songjin, moved by this kindness, could not any longer refuse, and he drank 3 glasses. He then spoke his greeting and came forth from the water palace, riding on the wind and sailing directly for Lotus Peak. When he had landed at the base of the hill, the influence of the wine was already manifest in his face, and a feeling of dizziness possessed him, so that he reprimanded himself, saying, "If my honored master sees me with this inflamed expression, how startled he will be, and how soundly he will chide me." He sat down by the bank of the stream, put off his outer garments, placed them on the clean sand, and dipped his hands in the limpid water. Thus he sat bathing his hot face, when suddenly a strange and mysterious fragrance was borne towards him. Not the perfume of orchid or musk, nor that of any special flower, but something wholly new and not experienced before. The soul of passion and uncleanness seemed dissipated by its presence, and a purity indescribable seemed to remain. He said to himself, "What wonderful flowers are these by the side of this brook, that such sweet perfumes should come floating on this wavelets? I will go and see from whence it comes." He dressed carefully, followed the course of the stream upwards, and found the 8 fairies seated on the stone bridge, so that they met suddenly face to face, he and they. Song Jin laid aside his pilgrim's staff and made a deep low bow, saying, "Ladies of the fairies' paradise, hear what a poor priest has to say. I am a disciple of the master Yu Kwang, and live on Lotus Peak. Just now I am returning from a mission beyond the mountains on which he sent me. This stone bridge is very narrow, and you angels, being seated upon it, block the way. Will you not kindly take your lotus footsteps hence and let me pass?" The fairies bowed in return and said, "We attendants who wait on Queen Wee are on return from carrying a message of benevolent will to the master of the temple, and have stopped here for a little to rest. We have heard that it is written in the book of ceremony concerning the law of the road, that man goes to the left and woman to the right. Now, as this bridge is a very narrow one, we are already seated here, it would seem further fitting that you should avoid it altogether, and cross by some other way." Song Jin said in reply, "But the water of the stream is deep, and there is no other way. Where do you suggest that your humble servant should go?" The fairies replied, "It is said that the great Tama came across the ocean on a leaf. Now, if you are a disciple of the teacher Yu Kwang, and have learned the Dharma from him, naturally you will have learned to do some such wonderful thing. There surely will be no difficulty for you to cross this narrow stream, instead of standing here and disputing with us girls about the way." Song Jin laughed and said, "I see by your ladyship's behavior that you ask that I pay some price or other for the right to cross, but I have no money, for I am only a poor priest. I have, however, 8 jewels, which I will present to you, if you will kindly permit me to pass by." At this he threw the peach blossom that he carried in his hand before them, and it became 4 couplets of red flowers, and these again were transformed into 8 jewels, that filled the place with sparkling light shooting up to heaven. The fairies each picked up one. Then they looked towards Song Jin, laughed in a delighted way, arose, mounted the winds, and sailed off through the air. Song Jin stood at the head of the bridge and watched them for a long time till they were lost in the clouds, and the sweet fragrance had melted away. In loneliness, as though he had failed of his highest hopes, he came back to the temple and gave his message from the Dragon King to the master. The master reprimanded him for his late return, and Song Jin said, "The Dragon King treated me so liberally, sir, and his urgent request to stay was so impossible to refuse, that I have been delayed beyond the time." The master gave no reply, but simply said, "Go away and rest." Song Jin went back to his little hut of meditation whilst the evening shadows closed down upon the day. Since meeting with the 8 fairies, his ears had been ringing with sweet voices, and though he tried to forget their beautiful faces and graceful forms, he could not succeed. However much he endeavored to rein in his thoughts, he found it impossible. His mind was that of a person half insane or half intoxicated. He pulled himself together, however, and knelt reverently, saying, "If a man study diligently the Confucian classics, and then grow up to meet a king like Yo or Sun, he can either become a general to go abroad, or be a minister of state at home. He can dress in silk and carry a seal of office at his belt, can bow before the king, can dispense favors amongst the people, can look on beautiful things with the eyes, and hear delightful sounds with the ears. He can have his fill of glory in this life, and can leave a reputation for generations to come. But we Buddhists have only our little dish of rice and flask of water. Many dry books are there for us to learn, and our beads to say over till we are old and gray. It may be high and honorable from the point of view of religion, but the vacant longings that it never satisfies are too deep to mention. Even though one gets to understand all the laws of the Mahayana revelation, though one proclaims the same and finds oneself exalted to the place of sage and teacher, when once the spirit and soul dissipate into smoke and nothingness, who will ever know that a person called Song Jin once lived upon this earth?" So his thoughts wandered. He tried to sleep, but sleep refused to come. The hours grew late. Sometimes he closed his eyes for a little, but the 8 fairies persistently appeared before him in a row and drove sleep distantly away. Then he suddenly recognized that the great purpose of Buddhism was to correct the thoughts and the heart. "I've been a Buddhist for 10 years, said he, and I had well nigh succeeded in getting done with the world, till this deceitful mind of mine got itself tangled up to the damage of my soul." He burned incense, knelt, called in all his thoughts, counted his beads, recalled to his consciousness the 1,000 Buddhas that could help him, when suddenly one of the temple boys came to his window and spoke, saying, "Elder brother, are you asleep?" The master is calling you. Song Jin, in alarm, said to himself, his calling me in this unusual way in the middle of the night can only mean something serious. He went along with the boy to the audience hall of the Buddha, where the chief had assembled all the priests of the temple and was sitting in solemn silence. His appearance was one to inspire fear and question. The light of the candles shone brilliantly. He spoke with great care, but with severe intonation. Song Jin, do you know how you have sinned? Song Jin, who was bowed low, kneeling before the dais, replied, I have now been a disciple of the Master for 10 years and further, and have never disobeyed any command or any order concerning acts of worship in which I have had a part. I am dark and ignorant, I know, and so am not aware of how I have offended. The Master said, there are 3 things that must be exercised in the ordering of one's acts, namely the body, the mind, and the soul. You went to the Dragon King and drank wine, did you not? Again, on your way back by the stone bridge, you had a long and frivolous conversation with the messengers of Queen Wei. You gave them each a flower and made jokes and light talk. Since coming back too, you have not put these recollections from your mind and heart, but instead have allowed yourself to be entangled with worldly delights. You have been thinking of riches and honor with all the other temptations of the earth, and have turned with loathing from the Dharma of the Buddha. Thus your 3 degrees of attainment have all fallen from you in a single hour. You can remain here no longer. Song Jin, overcome to tears, prayed for forgiveness. He said, Great Master, I am indeed a sinner. Still, my breaking the rule regarding drink was because the king so forced and compelled me, and my talking with the fairies was only because I asked of them the way. I had no such intention in my heart. Why am I thus condemned? I will go back to my cell, and though evil thoughts assail me, I will keep my spirit awake against them, and overcome their madness, so that a true mind will assuredly return. I will bite my hands, and I will repent of the wrong I have done, and my heart will be restored. It tells in Confucianism how one can thus return to the right way. As I have sinned, will my reverend teacher not give me a flogging and set me right? This is what I understand to be the teaching of the Buddha. Why should you drive me away from all possibility of reformation? I came to you when I was only 12 years of age, gave up my parents and relatives, cut my hair, and took the vows of a priest, and ever since have lived dependent on you. It is just as though you had begotten me and brought me up, and our love is as between an only son and a far. My cell is the special meeting place of the monastery, and my hopes are all here. Where shall I go? The Master said, You desire to go, and that is what makes me send you off. If you did not desire to go, who would ever think of sending you? You ask, Where shall I go? I answer, To the place where you desire to go. He then shouted, Hither, yellow turban guards. Suddenly the commander of the guard dropped from midair, bowed low, and received his orders. The Master said, Arrest this guilty man, take him to Hades, hand him over to the king of Yuma, and then come back to me. When Song Jin heard this, his spirit seemed to depart from him. His eyes streamed over with tears. He fell forward and cried out, Teacher, teacher, please hear me. Listen to what I have to say. In olden days, the great teacher Arun entered the house of a harlot and had intercourse with her, and so broke all the laws of the Buddha. Still the sacred Soka did not condemn him, but he took him in hand and showed him further clearly the way. I am guilty of a lack of care, but still, as compared with Arun, I am surely less at fault. Why do you send me thus to hell? The teacher replied, Even though Arun fell into sin, still his mind was repentant. You, on the other hand, have had but one sight of these seductive things, and have lost all your heart to them. Your thoughts are now turned to a life of pleasure, and your mouth waters for the riches and honors of the world. If we compare you with Arun, you are worse by distance. You cannot escape the sorrow and distresses that lie before you. Still Song Jin cried for mercy, and had no thought of going, so that the stern teacher comforted him finally, saying, Whilst your mind remains unpured, even though you are here in the mountains, you cannot attain to the Dharma. But if you never forget it and hold fast, you may mix with the dust and impurities of the way, and your return is safe and sure. If you ever desire to come back here, I will go and bring you. Depart now without doubt or question. That is the beginning of the story of the cloud dream of the nine. And that concludes this session, numero 5. Namaste, assalamu alaikum, shalom, mir, zaijin, adios, te chakaris, isimpe na asamuje, kirlik ufred. One love and peace, happiness. liberation.